now we're going to look at the grant scope cost estimate form, which is checklist item number 5. And before we get going with the instructions, we're going to go ahead and look at the actual grant scope cost estimate form, which is on page 36 of your guide. And I'll give you a moment to take a look at that and kind of absorb the information that's being asked, and then we'll go through the directions. Okay, so let's now go back to page 34. And we're going to go over the instructions of the form. So the purpose of the grant scope is to establish project deliverables for a phase that can be completed by March of 2025. Remember, that's the key date. Here, the applicants are going to list on this form the recreation features and major support amenities that will be completed with the grant request by itself, or the grant plus committed funds if you have additional funds that are needed to complete the project. And remember, on pages 5 and 6, there are examples of what we mean when we say recreation features and major support amenities. Really, what we're looking for are those types of items to be listed on your grant scope cost estimate form. It's really to talk about the project deliverables that the public is going to expect to see when the project site is open. So it's also what our office staff is going to want to see when we come out for a final site inspection, as well as the state auditors. So that's why we're asking for you to list only recreation features and major support amenities on the grant scope cost estimate form, and refrain from listing any future phases beyond what will be completed with the grant and plus any other additional funds if needed. So the directions for establishing the grant scope are found towards the bottom of this page here in those 3 bullet points. You're going to want to use one of the phrases of those 3 bullet points here on the bottom of page 34 for each recreation feature or major support amenity. So you'll start with either acquire, construct, or renovate, and that all depends on your project scope. And then you'll see the last 2 bullets at the bottom of the page are for those projects that are going to incorporate lighting and landscaping throughout your entire park. So those are generally costs that are going to be more than $50,000, and they're not specific to a recreation feature or major support amenity. So that, they're going to be a standalone item. So if you're planning to do construction of lighting throughout the park, it will have its own line item, and then the associated cost would be next to it. And same with landscaping. So now we're going to look at page 35, and at the top of page 35, there's a box, and that explains minor support amenities. And these are things that you're actually not going to list on your grant scope cost estimate form. What you're going to do for things like signs, benches, tables, trash receptacles, we understand that those are often elements that are going to be incorporated into parks. So if you're planning to, purchase these kinds of items and install them at your park, that's fine, but we want you to fold the costs into the related recreation feature or major support amenity. And this way it gives flexibility to the grantee to construct, or if in the end, if for some reason you ran out of money and you don't have available funds to put in those additional drinking fountains you planned, it's not going to cause any issues with your grant. So it really, by folding in these kinds of minor support amenities, is really to help the grantee and provide some flexibility. Okay, so now for additional directions about filling out your grant scope cost estimate form. Before we go further, we're going to do a quick review of the eligible and ineligible cost charts, and these can be found on pages 49 to 52 in your guide. So Sam's going to take us there now. Okay, so while you're not going to want to get into this level of detail, Sam is showing us, and he's going to scroll slowly through to show you these that are the kinds of costs that are eligible for reimbursement should your grant be awarded funding. But you're going to be folding all of these kinds of costs into the related recreation feature or major support amenity. So right now he's showing, so for instance, here's some pre-construction costs that are eligible, and Megan will take us through these charts again in a little while. But for instance, pre-construction costs such as these, permits, bid packages, and so on, those are all eligible. And you actually will list those as one line item on your grant scope cost estimate form. And a key thing is to remember that a maximum of 25% can go towards pre-construction costs. So a maximum of 25% of your grant amount can be set aside, and those will all be folded into one line item on your grant scope cost estimate form. And then for the rest of the costs, for construction related costs, we understand that things like site prep, is often a given, maybe some demolition. Again, we understand those are going to be part of your project, but we don't want to see that called out on your grant scope cost estimate form. You're going to fold all of that into what recreation feature it's applicable to. All right, so as I said, Megan's going to take us through these charts in a little while. So let's go ahead and turn back to page 35. And we'll go over the final points about filling out your grant scope cost estimate form. All right, so you're going to include estimated costs for each recreation feature and major support amenity, and ensure that these costs, your estimated total project cost on this form equals your total project cost on the application form and on your funding sources form. So just make sure it's consistent throughout your entire package. And the second bullet asks applicants to not include the core services as a separate line item if they're going to be taking part in your project. So for instance, if they are going to partner with you and construct say your new trail, you're going to say in your grant scope cost estimate form, construct a new trail. And you're going to use the cost estimate that you received from the core service and put that in as your cost for creating that new trail. And then bullet number 4, we understand that costs can change during the course of a project, and that is fine. You're not going to be required to send in a new grant scope cost estimate form. But with that, applicants are going to want to build in contingencies into your related recreation feature and major support amenities as needed. Please do not have a separate line item for contingency. Again, you're going to fold it into your recreation features and major support amenities as necessary. And the final point, again, is to limit your project to what can be completed and open to the public by or before March of 2025. Do not include costs for future phases. With that, we're going to move right into the funding sources form, which is checklist item number 6. And Sam's going to take us to that form, which is on page 38 of your guide. So this is the form you're going to use if you have other funding sources. If you don't, as we mentioned, the grant by itself can pay for your entire grant as long as it's up to $3 million. If that's the case, you're just going to fill out the top line and then put in your grant amount request that you're asking, and it's going to be the same as your total funding sources because the grant by itself will cover your entire project. However, if it doesn't, and you have other additional funding sources that you are going to be applying for in this project, you're going to list them here. So the instructions are on the previous page, page 37. And what we're going to have you do is list each funding source by name and amount. And then also please indicate if that is a state, city, county, federal, or private source. There's also a note here that if your other funding source happens to be a loan, we want to know what kind of loan. And then also pay attention to this grant contract provision that we've taken out of the actual grant contract that you would be signing. So just take note of the use of the grant monies here if your other funding sources happens to be a loan. You're also going to provide a commitment date on your funding sources form. We want to make sure that all funds are committed no later than 4 months after the application deadline. So that's where you're going to be indicating in that column of date committed. If it hasn't been secured already by the time of application, we want to make sure that it's planned to be secured no later than 4 months after the application deadline. And really, this is because we want to make sure that no funds still need to be fundraised or obtained if the grant is awarded. And the second to last bullet here is if the funding sources change during the course of a project, a revised form is required within 30 days. So we do want to have an updated form sent to us. That's different from what I had just mentioned about the grant scope cost estimate form. So keep that in mind. And the final reminder is the total project costs at the bottom of the funding sources form. Again, make sure that that equals the same total project cost that you've listed on your grant scope cost estimate and on your application form. Okay, so with that, I see that we have a question in the chat, so I'll turn it over to Victor and then Megan will take over from there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. So if we can go back, Sam, about 2 pages prior, actually 1 page prior to the grant scope cost estimate form. Thank you very much, Sam. So the question is, if we are getting funding from another source, how do we separate portions of the project to have the cost estimate be equal to the grant request? So the answer is, let's just, for example, say your total project cost is $10 million. You would still list all of the recreation features and major support amenities on this form that represent the $10 million total project. Okay, so towards the bottom, you'll see that there's a line for total project cost, which is A plus B, and then the grant amount. So we'll know, okay, this is everything you plan to build. If the grant's awarded, these are all the things that our auditors, our project officers, the public will expect to see. Okay. Now, the second part of the answer is we do understand there may be a few cases where your other funding source can only pay for a certain feature. And let's just say that you secured $1 million for a trail and you have to spend $1 million on that trail. You can, on this form, you can list construct a new trail, parentheses, paid by CDBG grants or whatever the other funding source for is, if you have the need to identify what other funding source is paying for it. We don't require you to do that on this form. If your total project cost is $10 million, we're looking at what recreation features and major sport amenities will be either constructed or renovated as part of your project on this form to add up to the total project cost. And within that, how much are you asking from this grant request? And then Sam, if you could turn forward to 2 more pages, go to the funding sources form, which I believe for you would be page 40. For everyone else, that is page 38. The funding sources form, if your total project cost is $10 million, again, we're going to look at and let's say you're asking for the full $3 million here. We're going to look for $7 million of other funds that are committed on this form. So we're actually going to look at the dates that those funds were committed. There is a definition of committed funds in the back of the guide. Using the same example, if you have to, for your own local purpose, you have to be clear that a certain funding source is funding has to fund a certain feature, like a trail. Again, you could say CDBG grant parentheses for trail only, and then you'll list the funding amount for that for that for that trail. So that's fine if you have to. We don't require those types of notes. We don't require to tell you that, you know, the grant is paying for the playground, another funding source is paying for the trail, another funding source is paying for a restroom building. We don't require you to do that. We're really looking at the total project cost. What is expected to be built with the grant by itself or the grant plus committed funds. So a key point of what Natalie just delivered, a real key point for you, is if your project will require future fundraising, even if the grant's awarded, that means that, you know, this grant should not be awarded or requested. You need to come up with a project scope that you can complete with the grant by itself or the grant plus committed funds. Okay, so that's future fundraising is not allowed because from our experience, if you don't have the funds to complete the project, it could be years before the project can even be built, years of fundraising. So make sure that, again, key point today is the grant by itself or the grants plus committed funds are ready to go for the phase you are applying for. Okay, thank you.